Ancient Egypt is known for its vast pantheon of gods and goddesses. The Egyptian religion is one of the most iconic and most studied religions in world history. The funerary rituals of the ancient Egyptians were unparalleled. Their civilization was a world power for much of its existence. Suffice it to say, ancient Egypt made its mark on the larger story of human history. The pantheon is still studied, and many students take interest in their detailed mythology. For almost the entirety of its existence, ancient Egypt had been polytheistic. That is, until one pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, Akhenaten, decided to flip the script. For his 17-year reign, he had turned Egypt monotheistic. Since the rediscovery of the ancient city of Amarna, scholars have been infatuated with this maverick of the ancient world. How and why did this pharaoh make such a drastic change? Was there any precedent for a movement of this sort in the early 18th dynasty? How did Egypt turn back to the gods of old after the establishment of this new theology? Today, we answer these questions and more as we discuss Akhenaten, Egypt's heretic king. Many people who are interested in ancient Egypt are aware of the many stories of the gods and goddesses. However, these stories are not found in a single book or a single inscription. The myths that have been handed down to us are found in disparate sources ranging from funerary texts to short stories found on papyrus. Sometimes, these can be inconsistent or even contradictory. Mythology can change over time and region while maintaining the same characters. Because of this, there were local theologies and local practices that could not be reconciled, but they didn't have to be. Gods would generally be categorized into domains. Amun, for example, is a creator deity. Bastet, usually represented as a cat, is the goddess of motherhood and protection during pregnancy. Mat is the goddess of truth, peace, and justice. She is often represented as a feather. There are many others, but each are relegated to their domains and have sets of stories associated with them. How on earth would an empire with a mythology like this turn to monotheism so quickly? The plethora of mythologies in the pantheon lasted in Egypt for thousands of years until the 18th dynasty, when Akhenaten decided to turn the country to his singular deity, the Aten. The Aten, the solar disk, took over all the monikers of previous gods and their mythological roles. The Aten itself wasn't a new idea from Akhenaten's own mind. After all, the sun was there at the dawn of the Egyptians, and it was deified relatively quickly. The Aten was the visual aspect of the sun god. There were early associations of the Aten with Ra, the sun god, in the coffin text, for example. Phrases like Ra, who is in his disk, Lord of the disk, and Ra and his disk. The Aten was the manifestation of the sun god, but would later be understood as a vehicle as Ra traverses the sky in his solar bark. When I initially began my investigation, I had the sneaking suspicion that Akhenaten didn't come up with this new religion, which we now call Atenism, out of thin air. Akhenaten took funding from other temples and removed the names of many gods from inscriptions during his reign. An entire religious reform was in order, with Akhenaten ordering mass deportation, threatening detractors with death by fire and axe, and other actions a fascist dictator would take. With the amount of time I had spent studying the history of religions, I reasoned that the history of the Aten, and its eventual coronation as the one god of Egypt, had its roots planted far earlier. My investigation led me down a route that explored the relationship between kingship, divinity, and the Ka. These ideas culminated in Akhenaten's new religion for a time. Firstly, the core concept behind his new religion is the nature of kingship in ancient Egypt. While the actual ascension of the first kings of Egypt was a purely human endeavor, a myth concerning the origin of kingship had already originated by the third dynasty. The myth had already developed that Ra, the first king of Egypt, wearying of mankind and its affairs, retired to the heavens, leaving his son, the pharaoh, to rule on earth in his stead. If it's not clear already, the purpose of such a story is to legitimate the office of pharaoh. This was a tradition that would be upheld throughout all of Egyptian history. From these earliest days, the king was seen, at the very least, as being divinely appointed. This didn't necessarily mean the king was always seen as divine during life, simply a divine representative. Often, as students beginning our journey into ancient Egypt, we are regaled with stories about the funerary rites of the Egyptians. We see the vast array of pyramid texts written on the walls of pharaonic tombs to help them on their journey to the afterlife. We read through the various spells written in the coffin texts, an expanded and updated version of the pyramid texts, which would be written all over coffins. And finally, we are enthralled by the beautiful Book of the Dead, a spell book that the dead would be buried with that was filled with more spells than could be fit on the coffin texts of old. The purpose of these funerary spells was that the dead could move safely through the afterlife. In the case of kings, this journey ended with their deification. So while their time on Earth was not divine, their time in the afterlife certainly was. But that doesn't mean their divinity was entirely out of the question once we get to the New Kingdom. Over the years, the kingship was legitimized in many different ways. This would range from divine birth narratives, royal action, and succession. Famously, Hatshepsut had a divine birth narrative inscribed in her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. Often, pharaohs would even take up the moniker Son of Ra. To go even further, Amenhotep II listed himself as being the son of 6 gods. His claim was not that of literal sonship, like in our modern sense, but one of divine progression. The gods had chosen him to be the rightful ruler. Since he was the king, and the office of kingship was only held by divine right, he must have divine legitimation. We will explore this idea more in depth later. Many kings would claim their military campaigns were ordered by the gods themselves. Others simply legitimated their rule by claiming the royal line of succession. While this was usually enough, it wasn't always. Over time, the stakes of legitimation would rise. Eventually, people began to question the divine right of kings. This is most clearly seen beginning in the Second Intermediate Period. Throughout Egypt's history, there have been periods of prosperity broken up by times of strife or upheavals called intermediate periods. These periods share few things in common, but they show a break from the normal power dynamics of the country. The second of these periods is notable for the rise of foreign invaders called the Hyksos. The identification of the Hyksos remains in some dispute, but it is not the focus of this video. For the first time, control of Egypt was not solely in the hands of the Egyptians. These foreign rulers, often called by the Egyptians Asiatics, were of a West Semitic origin and ruled for a time in their established capital in the north, Avaris. They were often portrayed as heretics of some kind, but in reality, they liked much of Egyptian culture and religion. Hatshepsut claimed that they ruled without Ra. However, Ra is part of many of their names. They were said to be monotheists by the author of the story of Apepi and Sekenenra. Apepi was a Hyksos ruler, and in the story, he is said to believe in the singular god Seth. This was a story written around the middle of the New Kingdom, so some have seen a misinformed attempt at a polemic against Akhenaten, while others see a simple error of knowledge. The representation of them as monotheists is certainly incorrect, as the Rhind mathematical papyrus, which was copied from a Middle Kingdom original during Apepi's reign, is said to have been written on a scribal palette from Thoth himself. The Hyksos would rule in the north until Ahmose defeated these invaders and sent them on their way. It should be clear that in ancient Egypt the kingship was linked closely with the gods. This may have taken a variety of forms over the years, but the tie was undeniable. In fact, it was not until the second millennium that the kings were depicted as administering to the gods. In the earliest days of Egypt, the kings were not interacting with the gods, rather they were seen as much closer to them in nature. In artwork, a very popular method of showing relative power was through something called scale hierarchy. If a person appears larger in the image compared to other people, they are seen as more important. This technique is seen throughout the ancient world. In these ancient reliefs, the king was shown as being larger than normal citizens and foreigners. Their role was not yet one of a god, but they were certainly superhuman. In the second millennium, kings would appear in front of gods offering sacrifices. Historically speaking, the rituals would have been done by the priesthood, but the idea of a king being the middleman for humans and the gods was a very powerful method of legitimation. The human dependency on royalty solidified their rule and their role in society. In these scenes, they were essentially acting as mediators. The king is said to propitiate gods, give offerings to spirits, and judge humans. He was not divine, but taking on the role of the middleman for everything that isn't divine. This would only expand in later centuries. The task of the king was an establishment of the cosmic order. Perhaps the description of the king's interaction with the gods and humanity just given is meant to be an establishment of this order. In the words of John Baines, they were setting order in a place of disorder. This can most clearly be seen in one of their titles, Living on Maat. Maat, as noted earlier, is the goddess of truth, justice, peace, order, and all that is tangentially related. The epithet, which had only begun to see use in the New Kingdom with Amenhotep I, meant an establishment of order. While it may seem strange to our modern conceptions, there was a common expression about Maat being used as food or given as an offering. All this suggests that peace and order, especially of a cosmic scale, was highly valued, and the expression living on Maat means that they had established or solidified the cosmic order. In my summation, order here is understood closer to dharma or duty. If you or your reign align with the natural order or your natural place, you are living on Maat. The cosmic order is kept and everyone knows their role. According to Donald Redford, during the Second Intermediate Period, ultimately, because of the civil strife caused by the Hyksos in Egypt, there was a rejection of the idea of legitimation by sonship. This is because the Hyksos stressed their human ancestors, unlike the Egyptians, who often enjoyed stressing their divine origins. In a way similar to the United States' inclusion of under God in the Pledge of Allegiance to one-up the godless communists, the hatred of anything that could be Hyksos-like meant that rulers had to expand their legitimation methods. Son had lost its meaning for biological legitimacy, and was now entirely hierarchical. On the other end of the spectrum, the title Father gained a new function as well. Hatshepsut claimed that she made her temple at Deir el-Bahri for her father, Ra-Harakti. Amos, the first pharaoh of the New Kingdom, notes donations for his father Amun-Ra on the Karnak stela. Thutmose I said that his obelisks at Karnak were for his father Amun-Ra. Thutmose III even erected Benben stones for his father Ra-Harakti. With this rejection of sonship, a way was paved for new methods of legitimation. Probably the most important of these was the cult of the divine Ka. In ancient Egypt, the soul was understood to have multiple parts. For the sake of simplicity, I will keep it to the main three. The Ba is your personality. This is what makes you a unique individual, often represented by a human-headed bird. The Ak is best understood as the glorified soul. Once you die and go to the afterlife, your soul is in its most pristine state. A common practice in Egypt was the writing of letters to the dead in order to have the glorified soul of your relative ask a god for help on your behalf. At this point, since the loved one is no longer living, they are often referred to as an Ak. The final piece of the soul is the Ka. This has been understood in many ways, but it is most commonly understood as a spiritual double or a life force, often thought to be similar to a shadow. Let's take a look at some of the many ways the Ka was understood in the time before Akhenaten. The Boston jar stand from the First Intermediate Period, for example, contains a letter to the dead. In this letter, it seems as if a servant is speaking to his dead master. He speaks of the master as being before the Ka of Neferkara, a king. In a vast array of stelae found at Turin, scribes and attendants working on the Theban necropolis spoke of their Kas being justified. One of them, on Stela 2, speaks to the god Amun, saying, "As your Ka endures, may you be merciful." On Stela 102, a scribe pays homage to the Ka of Merit Seeger. On Stela 299, a worshipper's mother is shown propitiating the Ka of the god. There's also a significant relief of Amenhotep III being followed by his Ka in Luxor Temple. Unlike the common representation of the Ka in the form of hands, the symbol is placed over the head of a human figure. This is important because it lends credence to the idea that the Ka is a shadow, following the king in his procession. In my summation, the Ka can be understood as the essence of the gods. While everyone has a Ka, both royal and non-royal, the idea that the god's essence is that which gives life can be seen throughout the ancient Near East. Note the use of phrases like breath of life in many religions of the area. In this way, it can persist beyond death and can exist in a variety of forms, apart from the body. An address to the Ka is an address to this divine and eternal essence of people and gods. This is the best understanding of the Ka that I can come up with. However, in the New Kingdom, there seems to have been a development in the idea of the Ka. Recall that after the fall of the Hyksos, a new method of legitimation had to arise. With the idea of legitimacy being so closely linked to the idea of human ancestors, the Ka was ready to take its place. Perhaps beginning with Hatshepsut, based on her use of divine birth narrative and polemics against the previous legitimation methods of the Hyksos, there appears to be the institution of the royal Ka, a certain essence of divinity that existed in pharaohs that was unique, a royal Ka that was different from that of civilians. From the references I have found, I think the Ka may just be the immortal part of the soul that continues to live, or simply returns to the gods. She had special circumstances regarding her ascension to the throne, so perhaps she needed the extra boost of legitimacy. It is clear she was receiving plenty of criticism compared to other rulers. One such instance was just outside her mortuary temple, where she is shown in a sexually explicit position. This is certainly one of the more unexpected inscriptions I've stumbled upon in my readings. The idea of a royal Ka can most clearly be seen during the reign of Amenhotep III. This was Akhenaten's father, and by all accounts, a successful pharaoh. As mentioned before, pharaohs were deified in death rather than in life. Amenhotep III was unique in this. He had deified himself during life. In the tomb of Kuruaf, both him and his wife, Queen Tai, were depicted with solar attire, as well as garb of other gods. This unification with the gods probably was thought to have occurred during his first Sed festival, which was seen as a rite of passage where the nature of kingship is rejuvenated. In Soleb, he was worshipped as Nebmatre, Lord of Nubia. Furthermore, he was worshipped as Ta in Memphis. In fact, he was worshipped in the form of many gods, including Ra, Thoth, and significantly, the Aten. Of all Amenhotep III's aspects of deification, one of them can be seen as the most important for Akhenaten's reign. This would be his use of various epithets. While it was normal to think of the pharaoh as the likeness, progeny, simulacrum, and living image of Ra, Amenhotep III took this association further and appropriated divine epithets for himself. He used the titles Disk of All Lands, Disk of the Nine Bows, and more. He was a god in the flesh, walking amongst his people. Amenhotep III was undoubtedly the first pharaoh to present himself as divine during his life. Amenhotep even named his own palace complex the Gleaming Aten, and stamp seals that were used during his reign claim him to be the Gleaming Aten. He was worshipped as the sun god Ra-Harakti as well, which can be seen in a statue of him as Amun from the Amarna period, the period of Akhenaten. Soon after his deification, which could not have been long after his first jubilee, something we'll return to, he began to write his name without a cartouche. Recall that in ancient Egypt, the only names that would ever appear in a cartouche would be royal names. In fact, the names of all royalty were in cartouches. Amenhotep III subverted this idea, separating himself from the institution of king. As one inscription shows, he was the dazzling Aten of all lands, whose uraeus illuminates the two banks. His identification as Ra-Harakti is probably the most significant identification for Akhenaten, however. As mentioned previously, many pharaohs were fond of mentioning Ra-Harakti when dedicating monuments. Ra-Harakti is likely the antecedent to the Aten, and is even seen merged as early as the pyramid texts in spell 488. May you cross the firmament by the waterway of Ra-Harakti. Ra-Harakti can be determined as an early form of the Aten from a few strands of evidence. Firstly, there is the fact that in early inscriptions of Akhenaten's life, he is seen giving offerings to Ra-Harakti. In another inscription at Gebel es-Silsila, a sandstone quarry, we find that early in Akhenaten's reign, when he was still called Amenhotep IV, he was said to be High Priest of Harakti, who rejoices in the horizon in his name of light, which is in the Aten. The same title is found on other temple blocks as well. Importantly, one stela says that the stone was being taken, quote, in order to make the great Ben of Ra-Harakti in his name of light, which is in the Aten, in Karnak. This is significant because in Karnak, Akhenaten was known to construct temples for the Aten. This is especially seen in his cultic center, Gempaaten, which means the Aten is found in the estate of the Aten. This was probably the oldest of the Aten temples in Karnak. Furthermore, in what is thought to be his own personal hymn to the Aten, Akhenaten begins by saying that Ra-Harakti is the light who is in the Aten. He even addresses the Aten directly as Ra. We will discuss this theological treatise in greater detail later. For modern Western minds, it may seem strange to combine gods. It would be like saying Zeus Poseidon instead of either or both. In ancient Egypt, this was a very common practice. Consider that when we look at the sun, which you shouldn't do, you see the disk, the light, it's traversing across the sky, and its warmth. Each aspect of the sun was deified, and the Egyptians viewed these aspects as one. For example, on Turin Stela 299, which was mentioned earlier, a worshipper pays tribute to Khonsu Thoth Horus. This would be an amalgamation of aspects of these deities which would be viewed as one. The most famous one would be Amun-Ra. This would be a combination of the creator god Amun and the sky god, or sometimes sun god, Ra. There are many combinations of gods that are used to give credit to both gods as one unifying force. They act as one. Amun-Ra's initial appearance was probably with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt after the first intermediate period under Amenemhat I. This change in political landscape meant that Amun of Thebes, from the south, had to be merged with Ra of Heliopolis, from the north. Memphis, which lied between the two cities, though much closer to Heliopolis, became a new capital and was called Balance of the Two Lands. Unifying the two lands had always been a kingly task, going as far back as the famous King Narmer, whose exploits have been immortalized in the Narmer Palette. It continued through the rest of Egyptian history, where pharaohs would often be called King of Upper and Lower Egypt, or other related titles. Significantly, Second Dynasty kings even included both Horus and Seth, two gods who had famously been rivals, in their throne names. They were referred to as being at peace with them. Of all his methods of deification, Amenhotep III's idea of the royal Ka may be his most influential idea in the sight of Akhenaten. Bell argues that the royal Ka was the aspect of the king that linked him with the gods and his royal predecessors. We have already done an analysis of the royal Ka itself, so I won't be repeating myself, but I will expand on the idea as is presented in Bell's paper. He points out that in one coronation scene of Luxor Temple, as Amenhotep III is being given his Horus name, instead of receiving the usual Horus title during this rite, he receives the title Foremost of Living Kas. Furthermore, a similar phrasing can be seen during the Min festival scene, in which the reigning monarch, that being Ramses III, is called Living Royal Ka. The idea that the royal Ka is associated with the festivals and rites of coronation is no surprise. Kings are often seen as living, renewed, and rejuvenated during their festivals, as is seen on a statue of Ramses II at Luxor. Bell argues that the full union of the royal Ka and the body comes at coronation, in which case the royal Ka would be rejuvenated or renewed. Under this hypothesis, Bell argues that the mortal king is being endowed with the divine Ka and becomes a living god because of this. This is entirely plausible, but other interpretations can be argued as well. It's possible that the king saw himself as the divine Ka on earth. This would be synonymous to the royal Ka, which meant the coronation was a way to replenish the power of the Ka. In my view, the appearance of mirrors at the said festival of Amenhotep III lends credence to the idea that the festival was for rejuvenation, perhaps of a Ka, since mirrors were a common motif for this. Although this isn't proof in either direction. While both are possibilities, it matters little for the understanding of the Ka that Akhenaten would develop. Perhaps supplementing the idea that the king is somehow endowed with the divine Ka, or perhaps is even identical to the divine Ka, is the idea of pharaohs being an image of God on earth. A variety of New Kingdom pharaohs portrayed themselves as a reflection of God on earth. Hatshepsut is called the faithful picture of the eternal Lord, and both Amenhotep II and III called themselves the holy replica of the Lord of the gods. The living Ka motif fits well into this framework. Consider some of the topics we have just detailed. Amenhotep III identified himself as a god during his life. Royal legitimation, based on human actions and predecessors, had lost favor for divine legitimation. The position of the king had turned from superhuman man to divine mediator between the gods and man. The Aten cult had been seeing a rise in deified speech and imagery. There was an increased concentration on a divine royal Ka, and the king was viewed as an image of God on earth. With these in place, the field was set for Akhenaten to finally lead Egypt into the Amarna period. In order to understand how Akhenaten may have thought of his own position when it came to the gods and humanity, we must briefly discuss his life. While growing up as Amenhotep IV, before the name change to Akhenaten, with his father being an incredibly successful ruler, there was not much in terms of militaristic goals during his youth. It's likely he never even expected to be pharaoh because it was customary that the next king would become priest of Ptah in Memphis, before their ascendancy to the throne. However, this position was occupied by his older brother, so Akhenaten was relegated to the priesthood in Heliopolis. There very well may be a link to this life in the priesthood and the later exclusivity of Atenism. After all, he was essentially brought up by his uncle Anen, who was the high priest of Ra. However, his brother died early, and this allowed for his ascendancy to the throne. There's a great deal of debate surrounding the early reign of Akhenaten. Did he begin his reign as co-regent with his father, or did his father die before he became pharaoh? Both options are possible, and I will not seek to solve this problem in this video. Evidence could go either way, and it matters little for Akhenaten's theological views in the final years of his reign when his father was certainly dead. In any case, early in his reign, there was not much of a theological difference between him and his father. There were barely any noticeable changes in art or religion until the third year, when Genpa Aten was built. This would have been a normal course in any other reign, but Akhenaten went further. In his 5th year, when riding through the desert, he claimed to have a vision in which he spoke to the Aten itself. The Aten told him to build a new city, which Akhenaten would make his new capital. This new city was named Akhenaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten. This was very similar to his new name, Akhenaten, which meant beneficial to the Aten, and was changed that same year. The reason this place, now called Amarna, was chosen is because of the view of the Wadi, a valley. In the morning, the sun rises in this valley, and Akhenaten took that as a sign to build his new city dedicated to the sun disk. At death, he wished for his burial to be in the valley of this new city in order to unite with the Aten. This was not a new belief. In fact, in the story of Senuhe, a Middle Kingdom narrative text, the king Amenemhat I is said to unite with the Aten at his death. Akhenaten delineated the creation of this new city on his boundary stela. There were 2 periods in which these would be set up. The first covered a much smaller area, and the second round of stela were set up when the city was being expanded. The so-called earlier proclamation lists the king himself being the good god, unique one of Ra, whose beauty the Aten created. The title good god was taken over from previous generations, but in later years this epithet would change to good king. He also included a praise for his divine wife Nefertiti, who is adorned with the double plumes, a symbol of deification. The deification of the royal wife can be seen in previous generations as well, most importantly at Luxor Temple, where not only was Amenhotep III deified, but his wife, Queen Tai, was shown with goddess imagery as well. Interestingly, 1 month before this vision, the steward of Memphis, Api, had written a letter to the king, telling him how great the temple of your father Ptah has been. Nothing appears to be out of the ordinary. The king, here still called Amenhotep IV, is said to be the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, who lives on Mat, the lord of the 2 lands, the son of Ra. However, this letter was never sent, probably because by the time it would have made it to Akhenaten, it would already have been moot, considering the new circumstances. He had plenty of time to concentrate on deep theological issues, since his father had left the country in such a good state. Akhenaten felt no need to go off to other nations to conquer them and justify his rule, since, as we have already seen, he had a new method of legitimation. In fact, in the entirety of the new city of Akhenaten, there was no smiting pose. This was the usual artistic depiction for a conqueror or warlike ruler. When Akhenaten began his sweeping reforms, he claimed he was restoring the nation to its original religion, that being one of sun worship. While his form of sun worship wouldn't be recognizable to the kings that built the pyramids, Akhenaten was certainly right in that sun worship in Egypt was very ancient. Even some of his predecessors claimed the same thing. For example, when Amenhotep II revived ancient monuments, or when Thutmose IV cleared the sand from the Sphinx. This new focus on religion and its purest form created a dire need for a sophisticated priesthood. This functioned to set into place what Baines calls a web of overlapping allegiances. Unfortunately, for those involved in these revived old religions, Akhenaten would soon flip the script. In order to build his new city and his new temple, the Paraten, or House of the Aten, he began taking funding from the other temples in Egypt. They could no longer hold their festivals without the funding. Furthermore, he would remove a plethora of divine names from temples and monuments. This wasn't always consistent, however. Amun was erased from most inscriptions. Montu and the phrase, all the gods, were not always erased, such as on the stela of Thutmose III. Hathor's name was erased from Amada Temple, but the image was kept. A similar thing happened to Khnum of Elephantine, where the name was violated but the image was kept. Sometimes these names were kept even when there was clearly an opportunity to erase them. For example, in the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri, sometimes the plural gods is removed, but the name Amun-Ra was kept. Overall, there seems to be no consistent system of erasure for Akhenaten. He changed the language in many ways as well. As noted previously, he changed the epithet good god to good king. Under Akhenaten, the word Mat, meaning truth, was spelled phonetically instead of the hieroglyph used for the goddess Mat. In the same way, Mut, the word for mother, was spelled phonetically instead of the image of the vulture goddess. Furthermore, he removed the anthropomorphic representation of the Ka and perhaps added to the divine Ka a moniker of living on Mat. This can be seen in many cases of funerary texts at Amarna, where we find references to the Ka of the king supplemented by living on Mat. He even made it clear that the Aten was to be seen as a heavenly pharaoh. He even enclosed its name in double cartouches. No other god had received this kind of treatment. On the other side of the heavenly pharaoh coin is the idea of the pharaoh being the image of God on earth, as discussed before. The monotheism pushed by Akhenaten was now more obvious than ever. At the center of this new religion was Akhenaten himself. In Akhenaten, he had made public showings of his worship and communications with the Aten. He had been a ritualistic centerpiece of festivals in the city. There have been multiple ideas as to why, including the possibility that Akhenaten viewed himself as a god and was the object of worship. To be sure, there have been statuettes of Akhenaten found in private tombs at Amarna, which have sparked the idea that he was worshipped by the people. I think this idea is misplaced, however. In my view, these images of Akhenaten were seen as more of a conduit. If you wanted to communicate with the Aten, you had to appeal to Akhenaten himself, not because he was God, but because he was the divine Ka. In a sense, he was not fully divine yet. His full divinity would only be achieved when merging with the Aten at death. In modern terms, he had not achieved his final form. Akhenaten was probably part of the procession during the festival in order to facilitate communication with the Aten. This is demonstrated by multiple inscriptions where the people focus on how he can be seen and heard. You are the light. I live at the sight of you. I thrive at hearing your voice. May I hear the voice of the king when you perform servants to his father. And there are many more. Perhaps his importance during the festivals and in worship at homes can be easier understood if we look at his identification as high priest. As noted earlier in the Gebel as-Silsila inscription, he was listed as high priest of Ra-Harakti before the move to Amarna. There is also evidence of him acting as high priest during his father's Jubilee festival. With the connection that we established previously of Amenhotep III being identified with Ra-Harakti, it is likely that Akhenaten saw himself as the means of communication. In this way, his place at the festivals was to be a conduit for God and man. Similarly, he would be treated this way in the home as well. It's not that he is being worshipped, but the people are using his image to communicate with the Aten. Akhenaten was set on replacing the gods of Egypt with this new Aten cult. He began to take traits of the other gods and include them in his theological view of the Aten. For example, the title Self-Created One is used. Plenty of gods have been said to be self-created, including Ra and Atum. The Aten is said to be the creator of the universe as a whole, which was said of gods like Ta, Amun, and Ra. The issue of uniqueness is in view as well. The epithet, which I will not attempt to pronounce, has been variously translated as unique, alone, or one. Depending on theology, these could have very different meanings. It's likely that the meaning of the term either changed over time or simply was context dependent. For example, in the coffin text, spell 355, it says, "I am Ra, I was alone." Perhaps the word can still be translated as one if we consider oneness in nature, as has been favored by Christian traditions. However, we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. The epithet is used for many gods, even when they are of a pantheon. This means that the title was not an indication of monotheism. However, I will argue that Akhenaten's understanding was that of oneness in a way that makes the unification with the Aten comprehensible. Upon death, the pharaoh, being the divine Ka, will reunite with the greater essence of the Ka, that being the Aten. This will be seen more in the Hymn to the Aten, where the Aten is the one who gives life to the sun in his mother's womb, and one who gives breath to animate all he makes. These ideas of the Aten being the life giver speak to it as the source of the Ka, which was understood as the life force. All the aspects of divinity for the Aten that we have just discussed were also seen in the stela of Suti and Hor. In this adoration of Amun, when he rises as Heretic, the god is said to be one that created himself, and one of unique nature. He created all things and made them live. These associations fit well with the theology Akhenaten attributed to the Aten. Among other things, the Hymn to the Aten notes how the Aten sustains the life of both Egypt and its enemies. The extent of the Aten's embrace is emphasized with references to the entire world being filled with perfection when it rises, and more. Furthermore, we must understand the royal family in this framework as well. During the Amarna period, the family was often fully represented, a very uncommon feature in Egyptian art. One of the main modes of appearance was called the window of appearances, where Akhenaten and his wife are seen giving food to their subjects. Since both of them contain divine imagery, it is necessary to recall that Queen Tai, the wife of Amenhotep III, had been portrayed as divine as well. In this period, just before Amarna, divinity was very closely tied to royalty, the history of which we have already covered. Art was perhaps one of Akhenaten's biggest changes to the culture of Egypt. In the early days of his reign, there were no noticeable differences between his art and the art of his father. But as time went on, his representations became more deformed. At least that's the language that's often used. In Egyptian history, pharaohs were often represented as chiseled and in their prime. Akhenaten, on the other hand, was portrayed in a different way. This could be a deformation, which could have been a real disability for him. Perhaps it was meant to be hermaphroditic, or a return to some primordial state of humanity. There are many competing ideas on this, so I will not attempt to answer that question here. But it is important to note that Bach, Akhenaten's personal artist, noted that His Majesty himself taught the new styles. Akhenaten's reign saw massive shifts in culture and religion. He was harsh and fast in reforms. No matter how radical he was, the people of Egypt seemed to have moved on from him as if he never existed. They likely had to worship their personal gods in secret, while publicly only worshipping the Aten. Just as soon as Akhenaten died, his son, Tutankhamun, who would have been born Tutankhaten, reverted Egypt back to its traditional religion. In the Restoration Stela, it is said that the ruler repaired what was ruined and repelled disorder. The purpose of the restoration was to be a return to the primeval state. During Akhenaten's rule, it is said that the temples and the cities of the gods and goddesses were fallen into decay. Furthermore, the gods were ignoring the land. The religious reversions didn't end with King Tut, however. They continued into the reign of Horemheb, the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He would be known for taking apart Akhenaten's temple and reusing the blocks to build his own temple. And thus was the end of Akhenaten's influence, but not his memory. Even though his name was not included or even erased from a variety of kings lists, he remains one of the most interesting pharaohs in Egyptian history. What can we conclude about how he viewed himself and the Aten? In my view, he was the divine Ka on earth. He was that aspect of the royal soul on earth. He was not yet fully divine though. In my view, the fact that he changed a kingly epithet from God to king, and the fact that he neglects to use divine epithets for himself, which he applies to the Aten, means he views himself as intrinsically distinct from the Aten. I believe he viewed himself as the only link between humanity and the Aten because he was the Ka. Upon his death, he would unite with the Ka, just as his father had done. He viewed the Aten as the oneness of royal Kas from Ra to his own father. He was still seen as higher than humans and was therefore sometimes called a god by them in their funerary texts, such as in the tomb of Ai, his father-in-law. But in my view, this is only in a comparative sense, because many pharaohs of Egypt's past had been called god by the people. Was Akhenaten considered a god? No. Was he considered the divine Ka? Yes. Was he Egypt's first monotheist? Yes. Will he pique the interest of Egyptologists for decades to come? Also yes. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to all our patrons for their support. We couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet, be sure to like and subscribe. If you enjoy our content and want to help support this channel, check out our Patreon and Teespring links in the description. If you don't want to spend money but still want to see what we're doing outside of YouTube, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We're also live on this channel every Friday and Sunday at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time for our biblical readings, so don't miss the live show. We'll see you next time.